What is death? Death, as defined by Encyclopedia Britannica, is the total cessation of life processes that eventually occurs in all living organisms. In the world of Elden Ring, death is not so simple. After conversing with other lore enthusiasts, conducting research, and some deep pondering with more than one alcoholic beverage, I came to the conclusion that my understanding of death in this world was flawed. To me, it seems that nobody has a solid understanding either. There is almost no information in the game about what Destined Death really is, or how the removal of it from the Elden Ring works mechanically. To make things worse, there seem to be contradictions between what we think we know about it and how the game mechanics present themselves. Does Destined Death prevent true death of any kind? Why can we kill demigods? Why was Erdtree burial a thing when there is no death? How are the roots of minor Erdtrees watered with blood when there should be nobody dying to take their blood from? This will lead to a truly crackpot theory as I explore these questions and go down several death-related rabbit holes, and investigate the most troublesome aspect of this mythological world. Why do enemy mobs respawn? First off, I want to acknowledge the obvious. Hidetaka Miyazaki said himself that he designs these games with gameplay in mind, then weaves a narrative after the fact. So, to all of you people out there saying, "It's just a game mechanic, there isn't a lore reason." Yes, I know that the reason for enemies respawning is because it provides the player fodder to gain runes to help us level up. But that is not why we are here. Where's the fun in that? We are here to speculate and theorize, but since we are in such speculative territory, I do want to remind you that these are my theories based on my interpretations. So you may have your own, and I want to hear about them. But now let's get into it with a summary of events. It is said by Enya the Finger Reader that the Rune of Death goes by two names. The other is Destined Death, the Forbidden Shadow, plucked from the Golden Order upon its creation, stating that the removal of Destined Death from the Elden Ring occurred at the same time that the Golden Order was founded. It is unclear if the Golden Order was created because the Rune of Death was removed, or if this happened as a consequence. It is also unclear if the Golden Order encompasses the entirety of America's godhood, or if she ruled for a time before Destined Death was removed. However, recounting events that are confirmed as of the time of this video, we know that Malekith defeated the Gloam-Eyed Queen, and the Rune of Death was sealed within his sword. Prior to the creation of the Erdtree, death functioned differently. It is incredibly vague what would actually happen to those who died. The Helfen's Steeple description suggests that heroes of battle would be guided through a spiritual plane of existence. And in the Rancor Pot's description, it says, "In times of old, the dead were burned in ghost flame, and from those cinders arose vengeful spirits." Yet we also have the practice of the ancestral followers, whose origin in the timeline is unknown, but given their ancestral demarcation and the fact that they are found exclusively in proximity to the Uld and Ul ruins, I think it is safe to assume that their practices existed before the Erdtree as well, mostly involving the death of animals, it seems. In truth, much of this has little bearing on our topic, as all of these practices became obsolete upon the creation of the Erdtree. I just find it interesting, and it implies some things about how dying works in the lands between. Namely, that some action is involved in the process of moving spirits into their next phase of existence, and that a spiritual world was the destination. After the Erd Tree was created, a new method of death was formed that excluded this transference of spirits to the spirit world. This new system held that the Erd Tree was the center of the process, both bestowing life and taking the dead into itself. The Erd Tree required watering with blood, and two practices were developed. The first was Erd Tree burial, where labyrinths of catacombs were constructed around the roots of the Erd Tree, and the dead were physically forced into the space between the roots, eventually being absorbed by them. The second method was the collecting of bodies in jars, some living jars, and the smashing of these pots near the foot of the Erd Tree to let the blood and viscera seep down into the roots. So now, the spirits of the dead are returned to the Erd Tree and are presumably reborn at some point in the future, according to the words of the loathsome dung eater, of course. However, it should be noted that this rebirth process does not appear to be immediate. Now, this process of souls returning to the Erd Tree could honestly have nothing to do with Destined Death, as there is no link between Destined Death and the Erd Tree that is officially established, even if Destined Death was removed from the Elden Ring at the time of the Erd Tree's creation. Any assertion that this cycle of life and death through the Erd Tree being linked to the removal of Destined Death is conjecture, but perhaps the DLC will shed more light on this and even prove this theory correct. However, at the time of writing this video, I do not think there is a correlation. Let's examine Destined Death from a lore perspective before trying to explain the in-game mechanics. It should be obvious, though initially I was uncertain myself, but the Lands Between is not a deathless world even after the removal of the Rune of Death. Signs of death are everywhere, even after the Shattering, an event that certainly came after the sealing of Destined Death. Other Tarnished die, demigods die, there are corpses from the Shattering strewn about everywhere. So let's look at the name Destined Death itself. That is to say, death that is destined to happen. This interpretation is backed up by the Japanese version, whereas the kanji used for the name Destined Death could be translated as fated death. What is another way of describing a fated death? I think death by old age. This is how I now understand Destined Death based on these facts and others that I will elaborate further. Because the Rune of Death was removed from the Elden Ring, nobody is fated to die anymore. Therefore, being killed is the only way to die from this point on. It explains why the wandering nobles who survived the Shattering War are still alive. And this also is backed up by the Knights Cavalry armor description. The Knights Cavalry, who now wander the dim roads at night, were once led by the fell omen and were deliverers of death for great warriors, knights, and champions. Nobody can die of old age, so to give rest to the heroes of battle, they must be killed. So to reiterate, after the removal of Destined Death, the only way to die is from some external action. It also explains why we can kill the demigods, and it explains why tarnished NPCs can be murdered. More on that later. In the overture of Elden Ring, Miyazaki stated that the reason for the demigods' immortality is because Destined Death was removed from the Elden Ring, and yet we can kill them for good. So, with that established, The removal of the Rune of Death cannot be a reason that regular enemies and animals respawn when we rest at a grace. Since, given everything that we've discussed already, they should remain dead once they are slain. There is another point of evidence that suggests that the removal of Destined Death is not the reason for their resurrection, and that is what happens when we defeat Malekith and unleash the Rune of Death. The cutscene that immediately plays after defeating Malekith says, "The Rune of Death is unbound, and the lands between are shrouded by death's dark fate." So at this point, it's explicitly stated that Destined Death has been unleashed back into the lands between. However, enemies still respawn. I have seen some theorize that maybe the Rune of Death is held captive within our Tarnished. However, the fact that the thorns on the Erd Tree and the Erd Tree itself are already burned, and the capital is already ashen by the time that we're transported there, refutes this. Otherwise, we would have to approach the thorns and light them ourselves if the Rune of Death was contained inside of us, no? So to answer our central question, we must seek out an additional piece of the puzzle. Let's talk about grace. In the June 2021 interview with IGN, when Miyazaki was describing the setting of Elden Ring for the first time, he stated, "In the world of Elden Ring, the lands between are blessed by the presence of the Elden Ring and by the Erd Tree, which symbolizes its presence, and this has given grace or blessing to the people throughout the land, great and small. What this represented in them is this sort of golden light, or this golden aura, that's specifically shown in their eyes." So it seems pretty cut and dry here. According to the creator himself, all people within the lands between, great and small, have been given grace. The ancestors of the Tarnished in-game had their grace taken away, and were exiled by Queen Marika herself, knowing that one day the descendants of these Tarnished, and some of them directly in the case of Godfrey, will be granted grace again and resurrected. Miyazaki states in the overture of Elden Ring that this grace is the reason for the immortality of the player character. Paraphrased, he says, "The immortality of the Tarnished originates with the guidance of grace. That guidance won't let the player character go." So this is why we respawn, but he was clear in specifying that the grace won't let the player character go. So this isn't an open and shut case regarding the rest of the denizens of the lands between. As we established, grace can fade or be taken away. This is true of not only the ancient Tarnished, but the modern Tarnished as well. Our prophet friend Corin asked if we can still see the grace and is surprised when we can. Roger expresses a similar sentiment. Tying both the words of these two and Miyazaki together, this is how we can explain why the other Tarnished can die for good. The guidance of grace has abandoned them. When examining this further, it seems like an overreach to definitively say that grace on its own even grants continuous resurrection. This is supported in-game by the fact that the practice of Erd Tree burial and blood watering still exist all throughout the present, even after the time of the Shattering. The Crimson Seed Talisman states that the Erd Tree was once perfect and eternal, and thus it was believed that the Erd Tree seeds could not exist. And the Golden Seed states, "When the Elden Ring was shattered, these seeds flew from the Erd Tree, scattering across the various lands, as if life itself knew that its end had come." So it is my understanding that the minor Erd Trees did not exist before the Elden Ring was shattered, and yet they are still being watered with the blood of corpses. How could this be if all things granted with grace are automatically resurrected? I do want to add that this point is contested by Last Protagonist, content creator. though as of writing this, I still hold to this belief. And additionally, the Dragon Knight Kristoff's ashes state, after the first defense of Leyndell, Kristoff earned the hero's honor of Erdtree Burial for the feat of capturing Godefroy the Grafted. This event happened during the Shattering War, so we can say 100% that even after the war, both the practice of blood watering and Erdtree Burial continued. Even though the grace was certainly granted to these people, immediate resurrection was not a part of the deal. Returning to the question of why most enemies respawn, there are certain enemies who respawn that almost certainly do not have grace, namely those who live in death. There's also the question of all the animals and beasts who are resurrected when we rest out of grace. The nature of their grace is ambiguous at best. Given all this information, I don't believe that grace grants immortality at all, at least not by default. I am honestly unsure of what this blessing even entails. In any case, the player character being resurrected seems to be granted by Queen Marika, or perhaps even the guidance of grace itself. But maybe our interaction with the site of grace and our guidance of grace is the key to understanding this mystery. I can already hear you typing, "It's just a game mechanic, bro." Well, I hear you. And honestly, if you are satisfied with that conclusion and want to stop watching now, I don't blame you. Without a heavy dose of speculation, this aspect of the game really does feel like it has no ties to the world building that we've discussed earlier. But if you're willing to get a bit weird with me, let's just let the game mechanics speak for themselves through what we do understand. So, to finally get to my theory, what if Queen Marika, notably not Radagon, through the guidance of grace, is curating a world that effectively supplies an endless number of enemies to slay, allowing us to gain runes which we use to grow our strength, or dex. We know that Marika is the one who returned our grace to us, and we also know that she instructed Master Hugh to forge a weapon to slay a god. So we also know that it is Marika who wants us to complete our journey, despite what Gideon believes. She has the ability to raise people from the dead, seemingly on a whim, as evidenced by the Tarnished people's resurrections, and we know that she is very selective in who she provides this resurrection to. Perhaps this is why only the fodder enemies and animals respawn, yet more powerful enemies and bosses do not. After defeating, say, Estelle, we have proven our strength, and Marika / the guidance of grace doesn't need us to prove so again. From a more meta perspective, this is exactly what From Software aims to do for us. They want us to beat the game. Am I saying that Queen Marika is an analog for Miyazaki? Not exactly, but I see no reason why this aspect of the game design wouldn't become a part of the lore either. If we can use things like real-world history, tangentially related psychological studies, and cut content, see no reason why we can't pull meaning from one of the most prolific of the game's mechanics as well. This all makes sense, right? This doesn't sound crazy at all, right? Right? At the end of it all, the question of why certain enemies respawn most likely comes down to gameplay considerations. Yep, it's just a game mechanic, bro. Or is it? Just kidding, but if you made it to the end, I want to thank you so much for your time and for listening to my crazy headcanon. That is what it is after all. The real reason behind this mystery is up to each of us to interpret in our own way. So, if you found the video entertaining, or informative, or schizophrenic, or any combination of the three, I would really appreciate it if you gave the video a like and subscribed. More Elden Ring content is definitely on the way, as well as content for other games too, so leave a comment and let me know what you think. Until next time, don't you dare go hollow.